So 1 Samuel 26, we're going to be reading not the whole thing, but we're going to read various sections of it. We're going to read 1 Samuel 26, verses 7 through 14, and then 17 and 21 through 25. Is that me making that noise? There we are. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the other soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike twice." But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed, and who can be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into a battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and the water jug that are near his head, and let's go." So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill some distance away, and there was a wide space between them. He called out to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner replied, "Who are you who calls to the king?" Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is this your voice, David, my son?" Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. Here is a king's spear." David answered, "Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into the Lord's hand today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I value your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble." Then Saul said to David, "May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph." This is the word of the Lord. Amen. I wonder why I'm making noise. There we are. So we're in the middle of our summer series on David, and what a good series it has, especially to have it over the summer holidays. Kudos to Charles for choosing it. And I say that because it's a bit like the series The Chosen, in that they have episodes. There's episodes in sections of David's life. And in these individual episodes, such as in The Chosen, there's a biblical truth that comes out of it. Did he catch that? Very important. Each episode of David's life has a biblical truth in it. It's a bit like life, isn't it? If we keep our eyes looking up, whatever comes our way, our own episodes, we find Jesus searching our hearts, teaching us new truths, and yes, about ourselves, but more importantly about God and his heart, which ultimately has a positive effect on us. It's like the word Dulcie shared last week, I understand. It plants flowers in our lives that push out the weeds. Yeah? And you see, in our life, our own life, we have episodes that we can learn biblical truths on when we fix our eyes on Jesus. But note, by God's grace, sometimes these episodes are repeated. As we're going to see in our reading today, they're repeated until we get it. God, by his grace, will repeat things until we get it, until we understand it. And so I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there are two ways to look at David's life. We can either look at it horizontally as moral lessons, and that's good, yes, and important. But I think what we really want to do is be looking vertically and looking through David to see Jesus and his gospel, so those flowers can be planted in our hearts. So we're going to start today looking up And we're going to be looking at chapters 24, 25, and 26. And the points we're going to look at is, how do we put things in God's hands? That's actually what this account is all about. How do we put things in God's hands? And so we don't take things into our hands through self-preservation. That's the first thing we're going to look at. Or through self-promotion. But rather we let God give us self-revelation. Okay? Self-preservation, self-promotion, and self-revelation. So I want to start with the story of me looking up. And it was in the 1980s. And I invited my brother Glenn and his good friend Johnny Johnson to come down and stay with us in Minneapolis. What a name, huh? Johnny Johnson. To come down and stay with me for a weekend in Minneapolis where I was living. And within a minute of them arriving, Johnny saw 2 pairs of boxing gloves that my flatmates and I had in the corner of our flat that we messed around. Red boxing gloves. I'll never forget them. You'll soon find why that is. And we just do a few rounds in the front room messing about. But you see, Johnny was a fighter. Johnny was a real boxer. His dad was almost a professional boxer. And everyone knew in our hometown, you do not mess with Johnny Johnson and his brothers, because their father taught them how to box. They knew how to box. Boxing is a real skill. It's a real skill, actually. And Johnny saw this, and Johnny, right away, he was encouraging me. I think a better word is he was taunting me to go around with him. And I just said, no, John, I'm not gonna box with you, Johnny. But somehow, some way, to this day, I don't know what I was thinking. I found the boxing gloves were on my fist, and I was boxing Johnny. And in doing that, I first gave him a left jab. And to my surprise, it landed. It landed. And Johnny said, wow, Dean, do you box? He was encouraging me. Do you box? And so I was feeling pretty good about myself. And so I thought, right, a right hook. And when I landed too, Johnny gave one of these Ali's, if you know Ali sometimes will act like he's out, but he's not. And Johnny did that. And I thought, I know what, I'm going to give him an uppercut next. And somewhere between my upper and my cut, the lights went out. And all I remember is waking up and Johnny and my brother standing over me going, are you okay, Dino? Are you okay? One punch. Johnny threw one punch and I was out. And I say that because in our reading, there's a man very similar to Johnny Johnson, a fighter. And it just took him one punch. So the first point that we're going to look at is what's called, do not take things into your own hands. If you want to put things into God's hands, don't put into your hands self-preservation. Okay, you with me so far? So let's read about this. Verses 8 and 9. Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. And we're on slide 4. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike twice. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Here David and his nephew, Abishai's his nephew. And Abishai means my father is Jesse, because he's Jesse's grandson, David's nephew, through David's sister Zeruiah. And importantly, Abishai, brother Joab, which you want to remember for the future. And what we're going to see is they have a tendency to take things in their own hands. Very brave. You see, Abishai, like Johnny Johnson, it only took one punch. Here, David and Abishai find King Saul in the middle of a camp with soldiers in deep sleep, which should most likely would have reminded them of Gideon in Judges 7 when a similar thing occurred. And here Saul, like every good soldier, is lying with a spear and water jug next to his head, ready to grab in case there's a surprise attack. And seeing this, Abishai assumes God has delivered Saul into their hands. Now let me pin him to the ground one thrust of the spear, it won't take me twice. You see, if this was us, we would be going, and there'd be screaming and shouting and blood, and everyone would be awake, but not awake, I should say, but not for Abishai. One strike. That's all it would have taken. He was a trained fighter. It would be swift and it would be quick. But what's significant here is the assumption that God delivered Saul into their hands. You see, this isn't the first time this occurred. And as the video showed, or what you'll see, we're going to go into verse 24, chapter 24 here, because it happened one time before. Remember that thing about episodes and repeating and learning lessons? See, this happened before. It was in a cave. Saul came into the cave where David and the soldiers were. So just let me read this. Verses 3 through 7 in chapter 24. Saul came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave, and the men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands, you to deal with as you wish." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of the robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. So what's going on here? Two very similar accounts, but slightly different. The first one, Saul comes into their camp to relieve himself. It has to be said. I'm sorry. And the second is David goes into Saul's camp, and no doubt David and Abishai believed in themselves, but God too, to do such an act. So earlier we were speaking about episodes in our lives, and that God's grace at times allows episodes to repeat until we learn the lesson. I wonder if that's not what is happening here for David. I think that's what's happening for David, because the first time David got it wrong. He got it wrong. He even said it. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of the robe. And what is interesting, he knew he got it wrong. The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to the master, the Lord's anointed. And we long, and we along with his men say, "What's the big deal, David? What's the big deal? You could have killed him, but you just cut a piece of his robe off." But here is what is wrong about this. Slide 6. David knew his heart, you see. David, who is described as a man after God's own heart, here he sees what was in his own heart. Do you get that? But what does that mean to be a person? We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a person after God's heart? And I think the best description I've seen is David was an Old Testament man with a new covenant heart. David was an Old Testament man with a new covenant heart. He knew God. He knew the heart and nature of God. The more of God he knew, the more he wanted to know and get God's heart. Like those flowers Dulcie spoke of in his own heart. That is why we see David writing such things as in Psalm 139, "Search me and know my ways. Try me and test me that I may have your eternal life." That is what it means to be a person after God's own heart. But I can hear you say, "I don't get it, Dean. He could have killed Saul, but he just cut a piece of the robe off." But somewhere between cutting that robe off and going back to his men, David heard God. God spoke to David. It says this in chapter 24, verse 5, David was conscience-stricken. Can you say that with me? Conscience-stricken. He was troubled, what he did. So what's going on here? I wonder if David realized in his own heart he was killing Saul. Do you see? David in his own heart realized he was killing Saul. And the Lord convicted him of it. It was a hard issue, you see. Because I wonder if David doing this, cutting a bit of the robe off, was giving a message to Saul. And I recognize this is speculation, but it's good speculation, because why was he so convicted? Because, there was another robe torn. Do you remember that? Samuel, when he rebuked Saul, Saul grabbed his robe and tore it, and that's when Samuel said, the Lord has torn the kingdom from you and given it to someone better. You see, I wonder if David cutting off Saul's robe was saying, rubbing it in Saul's face. What do you think? It's being passive aggressive. Do you know what passive aggression is? Hidden anger. Hidden anger. Man, it's running throughout the Western world. It's running throughout the West. Hidden anger. And I think if not convicted by God, David might have even held it up in front of Saul and said something like, remember, Saul, remember what's coming. Do you get it? Do you see that? I think that's why he was so convicted. Now, there's no way we can know if that's the case. And maybe it was just simply because he was anointed and God was telling him this. But whatever you may think it is, it says that David realized the wrong that he was doing. And it says in verses 9 and 10, who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master. Tim Keller calls that sentence David's theme for this section of 24, 25, and 26 chapters. Listen how Chuck Swindoll puts this. And I just want to highlight a couple things. Some books. Chuck Swindoll's excellent book. There's a series. He does one on Joseph. It's a series of 5. Eugene Peterson, Leap Over the Wall. A brilliant book. This is an old book I have, Men of God's School, which has a section on David. And R.T. Kendall, our friend, also has a book on David. Worth a read, those books, and I'll leave them up here for after the service. But listen what Chuck Swindoll says. When we really want to support our idea the way we want to do something, we often say, the Lord led me to do that. And here are David's men saying, God put him, Saul, in your hands. Here's a sword. But instead of gloating over what he had done, cutting the robe, David became troubled. David cut off part of the king's garment, and now he is experiencing guilt. Listen to these words of Jesus. Listen to these words of Jesus. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to death. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother and sister, reka, which means vain or emptiness or worthless, is answerable to court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Why? Because it's a hard issue. It's a hard issue. So what this tells us is that we should be careful not to take things into our own hands through self-preservation and defense of ourselves. So how should we apply this? I was thinking about this. Can I suggest this? Think about what weapons you're good at using. What weapons are you good at using to defend yourself? It only takes one blow of that weapon to get the job done. Let me name a few. And God might speak to you here, but let me name a few. Your intellect, your looks, your strength. In my case, my authority, your authority, your humor, your spiritualness, to name a few. How do we use such things against each other when we defend ourselves? And how does that grieve God? And what is going on in our hearts when we do this? We should not take things into our own hands through self-preservation, but rather we're to place them in God's hand. That's the first point. That's the first point. You with me? The second point is this. We should not take things into our own hands through self-promotion. There's something about self-promotion that is off-putting for God. There really is. And it's worth looking at. And yet it's a human nature, isn't it? We see the disciples doing it and their mom doing it. Can one sit on the left and one sit on the right of you, Jesus? And it might be simply the issue of lack of trust in God, you see. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. If that may be the issue why it's off-putting to God. But we all know this. We all know this. And that really, I think that's a milk issue, if you're with me. It's not meat, like Paul puts it. But I think there's more to this than just taking a position that's not yours or sitting too far up in a seat, if you will. It's more than simply just putting ourselves ahead. It's also putting others down, you see. It's the thinking, I'm superior to you. Or the thought that they're not significant. Or comparing yourself to others. I would never do that. I'd never do that. And again, where this takes place is in our hearts. It's in our hearts. So let's look at an episode within an episode of David's life. And we can't forget this, that this section is teaching David a lesson to help him become king. A lesson of justice, forgiveness, mercy, and not self-promotion. And it's all about a man named Nabal and Abigail. Nabal and Abigail. Did I say that right? How would you say it? Nabal? So it's shearing time, and David and his men are giving protection to the local landowner by living near and protecting the shepherds and the sheep. And it was custom in the day that wealthy landowners at that time of shearing to give some of the proceeds to those who helped. It's a bit like tipping. There was no written law, but it was expected and a way of showing gratitude. So slide 10, it says this in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 25. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing at Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was intelligent and beautiful, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Celebite. Chuck Swindoll says how Nabal was described as being wealthy. It meant heavy. In other words, he was loaded. And he had all that he needed. Nothing was required. But it's interesting what Nabal means. Does anyone know what Nabal means? Does anyone know? It means fool. The biblical meaning of fool is different to ours. The biblical meaning of fool is someone who isn't dealing with their heart issues, basically, and living with it. We're going to come across this word again in chapter 26. He is described as being surly, mean. In other words, stingy, tight. But more than that, Nabal was evil in his dealings, demanding, deceptive. And he refused to acknowledge David's protection. And we see this in verse 10. Nabal answers David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters. Why should I give him bread?" Big talk for a small man. David, on hearing this, told his men, two things occurred at this point. David, on hearing this, told 400 of his men to strap on the sword because they were going to deal with it. What did he say? Kind of thing. Here's that same man who was just conscience-stricken for cutting off a piece of the king's robe, and now he's taking 400 men to go kill Nabal and his family. In his book, slide 12, in his book, The Making of the Man of God, the British evangelist Alan Redpath wrote this: David, what is wrong with you? Why, one of the most wonderful things we have learned about you recently is your patience with Saul. You learned to wait upon the Lord. You refused to lift a hand to touch the Lord's anointed. But now look at you. Your self-restraint has gone to pieces, and a few insulting words from a fool of a man, Nabal, has made you see red. David, what's the matter? Redpath suggests David's response would be unjustified. David would say, Nabal had no right to treat me as he did. Does he not know who I am? Saul was superior, but this man must be taught a lesson. But at the same time, Nabal's wife, Abigail, who's described as intelligent and beautiful, loads up a train of donkeys and with supplies for David. Do you see how David put himself above Nabal here, and maybe rightfully, but God is teaching him a lesson, you see. That's what's going on. He's teaching him a lesson that he needs to know when he becomes above everybody. You know, there's going to be a day he's going to be above everybody. He's going to be king. And so he has to learn the lesson of mercy and justice and forgiveness. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing, Abigail, who I mentioned, she intervenes. Blessed are the peacemaker. And Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins. And to cut a long story short, she went and she intervened and offered these to David, 200 loaves. What a way to do a man's heart, huh? And when her and David's path crossed, she bowed down on the ground and she speaks into David's life and says this. This is Chuck Swindoll's paraphrasing it. David, as I look at you, I'm looking at the next king. Don't ruin your record with a murder. You're bigger than that, David. You have been wronged, yes, but murder isn't the answer. You will have to live with that on your record. You do not need that. So wait, David, wait. And she adds in verses 34, when the Lord has fulfilled everything he's promised you, you don't want this on your heart. And you know what? The rest is history. Nabal had a party that night, and I'm sure Abigail poured out her heart to the Lord. And the next morning she woke up and told him everything that happened, and he had a stroke and died. Isn't it amazing? When we do what is right without tiring of it, God takes care of the impossible things. Let me repeat that. When we do what is right without tiring it, God takes care of the impossible things. Listen to David's response in verse 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." David learned an important lesson here. And here it is. Whenever you realize that there's nothing you can do about a situation, wait. Wait. Whenever you realize there's nothing you can do about a situation, wait. Wait on the Lord. Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire, and he set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. See, this psalm does not say David's situation changed. It didn't. Saul was still chasing him, pursuing him. But what changed is David. It was David that changed. When we wait, sometimes our situations don't change, but we do. So David knew not to put himself above the anointed king through self-preservation. And now he's learned not to put himself above a lowly fool through self-promotion. Do you see that? That's what's going on here. He's learning to trust God, and that leads us to our final point. And this is what it's all leading to, folks. So open up your heart if you need to shake about, because this is good stuff that's coming now. And it's a third point. And it says this: to put things in God's hands, you need self-reflection or self-revelation of ourselves. And let me explain. And now we're back in chapter 26. So David's learning. We're in 26 now, verses 21 through 24. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I've acted like a fool. And we'll just jump down to verse 23. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today. But this is David speaking. But I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I value your life today. Get that? As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. This is where we're going now. We've said all this before to get to the lesson that David is learning. The reason David is starting to realize that God dislikes self-promotion and self-preservation is because when we put ourselves above others, we actually are putting ourselves above God. It's so true. When we put ourselves above others, we're actually putting ourselves above God. This week I've been going, God, forgive me. Forgive me. Think on this. Although it has been some 10, 15 years since Samuel anointed David as king, here David is the rightful anointed future king. And yet, although Saul tried to take his life 6 times by now, a couple of them missing by inches. Something that happened last night. Still, David here in verse 23 calls Saul the Lord's anointed. Why? Why? I think it's because David is realizing that all people, in a way, are the Lord's anointed. Everyone has a bit of God, a part of God's grace and mercy at work in them. Genesis 1:27 and slide 15, it says this: so God created mankind, humankind, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. It's called the Imago Dei. The Imago Dei. Listen to the quote by Calvin, John Calvin, who's this, we take him as this really strict theologian, and sometimes he was. I think he's not as bad as what we think he is. But listen to these words of his. We are not to reflect on the wickedness of men, but to look to the image of God in them. An image which covering and obliterating their faults, an image which by its beauty and dignity should allure us to love and embrace them. Wow. In 2009, I was going for training. I was going through selection to go into training, I should say, to be a minister, an ordained minister. And it was a bit odd. It was like at 18 months. Other people, they had 6 months. It was 18 months, and I was still working at it. And I just had this sense that there was something more going on here, but that's for another day. But my DDO, she asked me, how do you feel about capital punishment? How do you feel about capital punishment? And no doubt, being American, she must have thought I was a gunslinging cowboy. Everything in me wanted to say, well, I think we should hang him high. But I said to her, God gives life, and only God can give life away. Take life away. And I said, and that's true for guilty murderers on death row, but it's also true about the unborn baby in a mother's womb, which she completely blew the top, got angry at me about it. And I said, well, one is guilty. And she said, well, that's a different case. And I said, yeah, one is guilty and the other one is innocent. It was John Milton who wrote about this and said this about putting others above God. He said this: better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Let me explain. He's talking about Lucifer's attitude, because you see, this is a very issue for Lucifer himself. You see, that's why I'm so upset. I've got Lucifer stuff in me when I act this way. Self-promotion, putting ourselves above others, belittling others, is putting ourselves above God, and that's the very issue Lucifer had. And so John Milton says, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Lucifer wasn't going to do it. And so many theologians speculate that the reason Lucifer, the angel just below the Trinity and the triune God, the reason he rebelled was because he disapproved of God's plan for man. He disapproved for God's plan for man. And Was it a third of the angels went with them? That God would grant such grace and dignity unto us that it would seat Lucifer and all his angels below us. Listen to these words of the Apostle Peter speaking about prophets in 1 Peter 1:10-12. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who spoke of the grace that was to come to you, they spoke of things that have now been told to you by those who have preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven. Even angels long to look into such things. What David is understanding here is that, yes, as the Lord's anointed, Saul must be treated with a certain degree of dignity, and he must not be touched. And so I will not lay my hand on him. I will not lay my hand on him. In the novel by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, not in the film, but in the novel, there's a section where Saruman, like Saul, attacks Frodo and tries to stab him. But the brave Sam, Gamgee, and other hobbits jump on Saruman to try to kill him. But listen to the words Frodo says here. "No, Sam," said Frodo, "do not kill him even now, for he has not hurt me. And in any case, I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind that we should not dare to raise our hand against. He has fallen, and his cure is beyond us, but I would still spare him in the hope that he may find it." What David, like Frodo, is saying here, and we're coming to an end, that in himself, yes, Saul deserves to die. He deserves to die. But as a Lord's anointed, as someone that the Lord has touched and created, he has to be treated with a sacred dignity. And so David would not lay a hand on him. To do anything else would be to be like Saul, to be becoming like Saul. It would be like to be like Lucifer. It would be like becoming like Lucifer, putting ourselves above God. So what does this have to do with us, you ask? Well, quite a lot. You see, you too are surrounded by people who may not deserve good treatment because they have, but yet they deserve, because they've been touched by God. Someone might be coming to your mind right now. We need to treat them with dignity. And so we must, in our words, our actions, and in our hearts, treat them as David did with Saul, as a child of God. As a child of God. I will not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed, as I surely value your life today. So may the Lord value my life. So as the band comes up, how are we doing with such things? How are we doing with these things? I don't think the world's doing very good. We saw that last night. Ben was shocked that the shooter continued to shoot amongst the people. You know, there was one politician who said, described the people who would vote for President Trump as a basket of deplorables. The language that our politicians on both sides are using is not acceptable. The things we have allowed into our culture of division, it's not acceptable. It's the things of Lucifer. Division, separation. So how, let me ask, are you doing in such things? Is God teaching you, like he did David, through episodes of your life, by planting these flowers in our hearts to push out the weeds, to have his heart, to be a person after his heart? And so, the last slide. What we do for this, we have to put things in God's hand. And as we do, we remember God is our Redeemer, not ourselves. So God will save us rather than we save ourselves. And we're not to put ourselves above others. In doing so, we put ourselves above God. But let God vindicate And as we wait on him, we'll be changed. And lastly, let God speak to you directly in this episode of your life. Ask him for revelation, and he will give it to you just as he did David. Search me, O God. Know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See that there is no hurtful way in me, and lead me in your eternal ways. Amen.